and good evening. Welcome to our book talk, The Soul of Judaism. We are welcoming authors Dr. Bruce D Haynes, interviewed by Dr. Michael Alexander. My name is Rebecca Miller. I work at the American Jewish Historical Society. We are an institution located just off of Union Square in New York City. We are at the moment still closed to the public, though we encourage all of you to visit us at our website, ajhs.org, to sign up for additional programs just like this one. Tonight, we're going to welcome Dr. Bruce D Haynes. He was born in Harlem, New York. After receiving his BA in sociology from Manhattanville College, he conducted applied research under sociologist and jury expert Jay Schulman, selecting juries for trials throughout New York State. From there, he went on to earn his doctorate in sociology from the City University of New York and was appointed assistant professor of sociology and African-American studies at Yale University. In 2001, he joined the faculty at the University of California, Davis, where he now serves as professor of sociology. In addition, he's now a senior fellow in the Urban Ethnography Project at Yale University. In 2019, he was awarded the Albert J. Roboteau Book Prize for Best Book in Africana Religions. He's going to be interviewed and in conversation tonight with Dr. Michael Scott Alexander, who is the Maimonides Chair of Jewish Studies and Associate Professor of Religious Studies at UC Riverside. He's the author of Jazz Age Jews, which won the National Jewish Book Award, and Making Peace with the Universe, Personal Crisis and Spiritual Healing. Alexander earned a PhD in Religious Studies from Yale University and a BA in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Pennsylvania. He has been faculty at the University of Oklahoma, as well as Temple University, where he was director of the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History. He has served on the board and as an associate editor of the American Jewish History, where he guest edited several volumes, including co-editing the color issue with Professor Bruce Haynes. Alexander writes about Jewish history, psychology of religion, and medical humanities. Welcome so much, and thank you both for joining us this evening.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca Miller. Hello, Bruce.
Hello, Michael.
We have a couple of more administrative things to do here, so let me just sort of do them. First of all, thank you to Rebecca Miller, who arranged all of this and invited us, along with Dr. Lila Corwin-Berman, who is the chair of the Academic Council of the for AJHS. I just want folks to know that we will be taking questions, but we will only be taking them through the Q&A button. So although if you just want to say something generally to the group and chat that way, that's fine, of course. But if you want to direct a question to Dr. Haynes, do it through the Q&A and I'll have a look at it there. Do not use the raised hand button because we're going to be basically ignoring that for all sorts of reasons, but also including Zoom bombing. So use the Q&A for direct questions. It will be recorded and available, and Rebecca will be coming on at the end to sort of describe how to get the recordings. Okay, I think with that, we can move forward. Bruce, this is fantastic. This is really, the culmination of a little dream that I had, which is to be able to talk to you about your work with the AJHS and to read your book, which is something that I waited to read, that I wanted to read something like it for 20 years, and it took you about 20 years to write the thing. So here we are. Not that you didn't have intervening work, but this was a real behemoth. This was a big project. And so if you could really just walk us into the conception of it, how you got started with it, and some of the details and detours that you must have taken while trying to figure out how to wrap your head around this very complicated but is super interesting and important book.
Michael, first let me just say it's an amazing honor to be invited to the Historical Society to give this lecture or to give this interview today. and to have my work so honored. And thanks to Rebecca Miller and yourself for having the ideas that make this happen. So your question, how did it get started? It got started in part because I needed a project, to be quite honest. I was an assistant professor at Yale, and I needed to come up with a project in order to justify getting a year's leave from Yale University, which was kind of a big deal because it would allow you to go do some research. And so I actually had a file card. I usually don't tell this story, but I guess I'll tell you the real story.
Yeah, let's hear the real deal.
I had this file card of ideas that I had popped into my head that I thought one day maybe I could do some research on them. And when I was trying to think up a project, my wife said, "Oh, you know, that project that you wrote down on Black Jews, I think that's really interesting." And I'm like, "Really?" So I go back to the file cabinet and I pull out the stuff and end up deciding that I'm going to see what I can do and come up with a project. And it occurred, and the idea emerged because my wife and I had joined a synagogue when I was assistant professor when we arrived in New Haven. And I was sort of surprised. We were recently married. She hadn't belonged to a synagogue before, and now she wanted to join. And I was trying to figure out, okay, how do I fit into this world? I'm a Black guy from Harlem. This is a pretty Jewish world. Now, I'm a unique Black guy to the degree that I went to a pretty Jewish prep school in New York. My mentor was Jay Shulman, who I have to say, I have to give a shout out. Jay Shulman's nephew or niece or someone who's a close relative is here in the audience. And I'll get back to Jay in a minute, but he had a major impact on my life. And while I was there at the synagogue, I started seeing Black Jews, to my surprise, as I'm trying to sort out where do I fit. And if you remember back in 1995, there was a very public conversation in the New York journals and in the public kind of discourse about a conflict between Blacks and Jews, about a falling out. And some of this was responsive to Louis Farrakhan, and some of it was in response to one of his ministers, Conrad Muhammad. And so you had this very volatile conversation taking place where everybody said, "Oh, the relationship between Blacks and Jews is over. It's done." Meanwhile, I'm hanging out in a synagogue. My mentor was a Jewish guy. And I'm thinking, are these voices of Black Jews in the conversation? Because everybody presumes that Blacks and Jews are not the same people. Meanwhile, I'm looking at Black Jews. So it was really from that set of, that context that I thought, well, let's find out who these people are. How do they get to be Black and Jewish? And that opened up a whole world of people who I didn't expect, particularly like the Hebrew Israelite community, for instance, I did not know existed. So I went out kind of naive. I thought, well, I'll meet mixed race Jews from multiracial marriages. I'll meet maybe kids who are adopted. I'll meet maybe people who are converts. But little did I find a whole world of Jewish practice that existed within Black communities. So that set me on a course of trying to understand first, okay, what is Judaism? Because if you have two Jews and you ask what Judaism is, right, we'll get three answers, right? And so trying to figure out what Judaism was part of the challenge, and then trying to understand what race was part of the challenge. And so as I got deeper and deeper into the project, and I was fascinated with the project because of the historic conversation that had occurred across the 20th century between Blacks and Jews. There was clearly a unique relationship that brought Blacks and Jews together in the NAACP and other organizations, that brought Blacks and Jews together in labor, that brought Blacks and Jews together in civil rights. And both groups were always referred to as, and somehow an other. And so I thought, okay, what's going on here? What's this relationship between Blacks and Jews? And can I learn something about race itself from an investigation of these people who are now kind of splitting boundaries that supposedly don't exist, or that were supposedly solid. And so it was kind of with those sets of questions that I began interviews, I began reading. The project turned very interdisciplinary. First, it was very based on interviews, but then the more interviews I got, the more questions I had about the past and about where people got their ideas from about the history that they were talking about. And so that kind of took me back to the early modern era. And so maybe I'll stop rambling there. I could probably keep going on, but I think I'll stop there.
That, I mean, it's true that the book, it's very well conceived and it is easy to read, but you're in Africa, you're in the early modern period, you cover a lot of ground and you cover a lot of different kinds of people, which makes it sort of an extraordinary conceptual project. I want to dovetail my own story with your story that you just talked about, Sima finding the card and saying, that's the project, Bruce, that's the project. So recently, you know, I have a daughter, Nick, who's 17 years old, and she's going through a period of you know, sort of Jewish interest, Jewish, you know, identity stuff. And Nick was sitting in my living room with my Kindle, and you can imagine my Kindle's got like 300 books about Judaism on it, right? So I said, you know, Nick, what are you reading over there? She says, oh, I'm reading the, you know, the Soul of Judaism, Bruce D Haynes. I said, oh, well, why'd you pick that? And she said, well, I'm just interested in Jewish history. I was like, that's it? She said, yeah, you know, I'm just sort of, and so for Nick, it's completely normalized. Like Nick could have picked up a book about Odessa or could have picked up a book about the Kabbalah, but this is not a curio for Nick and Nick's generation. This is just part of Jewish history. And I do think that you're putting this book on the shelf the way that you have really, it cracks a kind of color line, not just in Jewish studies scholarship, but really in the memory of the community or the communities that I think it's already starting to do extraordinary work. So thank you so much for that. And I actually said, you know, when Nick said that to me, I said the Shechechianu. That's the prayer thanking God for bringing me to experience this very moment. And it's true. I thought, wow, Bruce went and cracked the color line for the Jewish people. So I want to ask you now, let's get into some of the details about these communities. And you have three basic chapters about three basic kinds of Jews of African descent. You have Hebrew Israelites as a kind of a category, Black converts as a kind of a category, a really fascinating one, and biracial Jews also. Can you walk us through them? And while you're doing that, David Coleman from the Q&A wants to know approximately what are the numbers that we're talking about Black Jews, and I think he means in America.
Okay, well, let me start with the last question first, because that's easier.
Okay, great.
So the first, depending on which survey you look at, anywhere from 1.7 to 2.1% of the American Jewish population self-identifies as Black and Jewish. And those numbers are should be understood with the growth of the multiracial Jewish community, which those numbers are growing, I think, maybe even faster when we look at the distinction between, say, 1990 and the current era. And there we have anywhere from 10 to 12% of the American Jewish population that self-identifies as non-white.
Okay.
So, question 2, Israelites, converts, and biracials. What's interesting to me, in some ways, it might be those categories that stand out in the way the book reads. But I guess those are only some of the categories in terms of how I have come to see the community. So for me, it's more that I saw Reform, Jewish Renewal, Orthodox, people who were on the fringes, who belonged to nothing, people who were practicing through the King James Bible, people who were seeking a return to what they believe was their ancestral religion. So those are sort of different groups. But to walk us through the groups that you identified, the Israelite community can be loosely defined as indigenous communities of Black Jews that emerge out of Black contexts, some of which emerge in the late 19th century in places like Kansas. Some emerge in the early 20th century, particularly in the early 1920s and 30s, in places like Chicago and New York. And they're interesting because you have different intersections of religious practice as Black people come into the cities. And so we also have Judaism mixed with Islam in amongst a couple of groups, and Judaism mixed with Christianity amongst a few groups. So there's a whole world of Messianic Jews that I didn't even talk about in the book. And so I had to make a decision on, so this is what was interesting. Well, where is that boundary of who's a Jew? And so one of the things I started to understand is that Rabbinic Judaism in its modern form has sort of split into the different traditional movements. And the Hebrew Israelite community, as they began practicing, was completely outside of any of those movements. So some of them have used the King James Bible as a way to read Judaism back into their identities. So they're doing a kind of biblical exegesis. Others, like the Ethiopian Hebrews, known as the Commandment Keepers in New York, they tended to be very serious about their approach to Judaism. So from the very beginning, we see some of their members speaking Yiddish. We see some of their members learning Hebrew. By the 50s, we see some of their members going to yeshiva. And they saw themselves as what they refer to as Baal Teshuvah, which is an Orthodox term, meaning that they saw themselves as returning Jews to their Jews who had gone astray, and that they were returning to their true practice. So rather than seeing themselves as converts, they saw themselves as returning Jews. So you have all these different kinds of people within what we might loosely call the Hebrew Israelite community. Some who are really leaning towards traditional practice, like the Ethiopian Hebrews. They read Mishnah, they follow Talmud, and they believe that with each generation, they're going to bring more knowledge back to their community. And which is why they're so focused on sending young folks to yeshivas. And then you have groups like some of the groups that have been in the newspapers recently, that like the gentlemen who were in Washington, D.C. a year and a half ago that drew national attention, and their video went viral. And so they're considered Hebrew Israelites as well, although they refer to themselves as Black Hebrews as an organization. And so you have organizational names, and you have sort of this generic name of the Hebrew Israelite community that's sort of all inclusive. And so that's sort of one aspect. And then, as I said, you have all of the traditional branches of Judaism. And I found Black Jews in all of those branches. And surprisingly, amongst the Orthodox, many of whom were converts. And I guess what the last category is the biracial, biracial Jews. In some ways, they might be, in some ways, the group that I expected to find, you know, but also in some ways, the group that might be the most interesting, precisely because both communities see them as legitimately holding membership within their community.
Right.
And so in that way, they defy some of the challenges that, say, Hebrew Israelites face when people say, well, are you really Jewish or not? The biracial Jews sort of bypass that, particularly the ones with matrilineal descent, but of course, increasingly those with patrilineal descent, given that most American Jews are now Reformed and or secular.
Right.
So, I think that's more. I think I covered. I don't want to go ramble on too long, but I think those are the three categories that you mentioned.
Yes.
One
Okay.
of the things that I might say that would tie all of these groups together and make them stand alone from some of the other Israelite groups is that Jesus is out of bounds. And the notion of Messianic Judaism is an affront to their notion of being Jewish. And then, of course, I just forgot to mention, you also do have some Hebrew Israelites who choose not to use the word Jewish to refer to themselves and only refer to the ancient Israelites or to the Hebrews and don't use the term Jewish, in part because their narrative makes a racial claim about who are the original Hebrews. Right. And thus they say they're the original Hebrews and therefore, quote, Ashkenazi or white Jews are not.
Okay, and those would be the ones that sort of reject halacha, and they're more of a Bible-oriented.
Not only they reject the law, but they also tend to be more racial nationalistic in their approach to the religious practice in general.
So we're going to the subject of the racial project, which is such an important part of your book. We'll get to that, next. So and for sure, let's bracket it. But we still have some questions from the audience regarding these three categories. Let's go to the question of the convert. A question from.
I didn't really cover the converts too much, did I? I covered them a little bit, but okay.
Let's do it now. Bertha Braunfeld wants to know whether or not you identify as a Jew, or whether you're Jewish. And maybe you can do that as part of this question about who are the converts that you found. One of the most striking things that I noticed in that chapter was that whereas generally speaking, converts to Judaism in the United States are the result of marriages, people being married to someone who's Jewish and then coming into the tradition or the faith. Black Jews don't seem to use that. That's not the typical pattern of conversion for Black converts. So please just tell us a little bit more about who's doing.
Well, I would say it's not the only pattern of conversion.
Okay.
Okay. So maybe the first place to start is my own relationship to Judaism is that I have not converted. And when I first got married, people asked me, and it wasn't even a remote possibility. I didn't really think that I had any real connection to Judaism as a religion per se. But as I started doing the project, one of the things we were going to synagogue in New Haven, and I'm going to Learner's Minyan. And increasingly, we're living within Jewish contexts. And I'm writing this book and I'm meeting Black Jews and I'm talking to more rabbis. And so, so more and more, I'm finding myself immersed in a Jewish world. And at first, to be quite honest, I'm not sure I understood converts. But as time went on, I began to understand what they were telling me in their interviews, which was that their connection to Judaism didn't occur because you woke up one morning or you went on a hike and had an epiphany and said, I'm going to be a Jew. That's not how it happens. It happens because people had some organic tie to Jews or Judaism in some way. So they meet someone, they have a close friend, and they're attending synagogue, and they said, "Oh, I like this better than Catholic school." Yeah, or you have a different gradual becoming a part of a community. So as I started to unravel this, and I go to the literature in religious studies, which I had no familiarity with, I see that much of the conversation about conversion is all about Christians. In fact, there's nothing about Jews in conversion. I thought, oh, am I really surprised? Not really. And so the narrative within the literature was that people had an epiphany. You know, they wake up one morning or they go on a hike and they say, yes, I'm going to become a Christian. And then they would go through their conversion. But that was not what was I seeing. That's not what I was seeing amongst my Jews. My Black Jews were coming through in a process as they became members of social interaction with other Jews. In other words, they were doing much like I was doing as I was living a more and more Jewish life, making more Jewish friends, going to synagogue with my wife, abandoning Christmas and now celebrating only Jewish holidays. I began, and also because I started having an organic identification with the ethics that I was exposed to. So that's the other piece. So I started really resonating with some of the ethical side of Judaism as I was being exposed to. So that really gave me a closeness. And I also sang in the Episcopal Church for 5 years as a kid. So I sang Gregorian chants. And so when I first heard my wife chanting Haftarah at home, learning that, there was some connection that I kind of suddenly understood because I'm studying history of Judaism, its relation to Christianity, and now I'm suddenly understood kind of how the Christians had in some ways appropriated this style of chanting, or maybe it's that the style of chanting was typical of the early period as Christianity and Judaism come into being. But in any event, this chanting, this kind of a spiritual chanting was really powerful. So I had my own personal connections. And so I started understanding that, oh, so it's not like you wake up one morning and decide you're going to become Jewish. It's that you are becoming a part of a community. And at some point you decide, I want full membership. I want to be. And so I could imagine, for instance, my wife and I don't have children, but we've been married 25 years. And I could easily imagine, had we had a child at years 5 or 6 or 7, that I would have converted, I'm sure by now, because I would have wanted the child to have, a coherent household, and I'm sort of this close as it is now, to the degree that I'm sure I know a lot more than your typical Reform convert. So I think I could, I've had, and I've even gone through the conversation, so to speak, in preparation for conversion with the synagogue here at Bet Havarim in Davis, California. And so, and he's sort of said, okay, what are we doing? How long are we going to have this conversation? Because are you going to sort of take the dive or not? And so you might say I've done everything except done it formally, at least at the Reform level. And the reason I think I choose not to, it's funny, it's kind of flippant, but I said this the other day to a friend. I said, well, I don't because it's not transferable. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, one of the challenges that I found that Orthodox Jews had was when they left their Orthodox community, Orthodox Jews of color, Black Jews, when they left their Orthodox community and went someplace else, people said, oh, are you really a Jew? And so I have a Yemenite Ethiopian Jew. In other words, both his parents are Jewish. One is Yemenite and one is Ethiopian. And this gentleman, who was in his 50s at the time, lived in Brooklyn in the Orthodox community, and told me that he had had 3 ritual conversions to demonstrate that he was really who he says he was. So when I hear stories like that, I start to think, well, I could convert here with the rabbis here, but is it really transferable if I choose to go to Israel? Will people still see that as legit? Maybe, maybe not.
Let's talk about this because it's a very, very important question. And you do a magnificent job of taking questions of legitimacy, not off the table, but pushing them to the side so that they're not the front and center question of your book or the communities that you discuss. Nevertheless, it is on their minds often. And this leads us a little bit into your discussion of what a racial project is. I'm not going to say that the halacha is a racial project because I don't think that it is necessarily. But I might say that the way that the halacha is implemented in the United States often comes down to only when it comes down to questions of race. For instance, if you ask if you take a survey and find out what percentage of American Jews keep separate milk and meat dishes in their homes, which is kind of a baseline for halacha and orthodoxy, the number is not, 10%, 15% maybe. So most American Jews could care less about the halacha, frankly. That's not what is the identity, marker, except when it comes to these kinds of questions about people of color. Suddenly the halacha, and have you had the legitimate, hechsher in order to become to, as you said, going through the formal halachic steps suddenly becomes a real kind of an issue the way it isn't for others. So I do wonder whether or not we have turned those formal strictures, we've racialized them and turned them into a kind of a racial project. Tell me what you think about that.
Okay, so here's how do I respond to this? Very complicated question, great question.
Okay.
I think it comes down to the fact that each Jewish community is independent. So there's a formal hierarchy. And it's that kind of independence that I think is both a strength and a weakness of Judaism. So for instance, when I look back in history, one of the things that was striking to me was how many times Orthodox Jewish communities or pre-Orthodox Jewish communities split. And as I'm breaking off, and half of us are going over here because we're wearing beards, you're not wearing beards, or whatever other small thing made the distinction at the time. Mm-hmm. And so these small distinctions can make the distinction over community. And so when I saw those kinds of battles being waged historically, I started to conceptualize sort of a far more fluid world of Judaism, where each community defines who's a Jew. So my community will decide, what I need to do to become formally recognized, right? And every community will sort of choose on their own to decide how they will choose to make that boundary, how to pass that boundary. And so that internal policing falls along the lines of the traditional movements. But holding to the strict law, and the key here to me is the law as it refers to matrilineal descent, or the law as it refers to patrilineal descent. And so the key for me is many Hebrew Israelites, for instance, their ties to Judaism is only through their patrilineal line. And so historically people have said, well, they're not Jews because, well, their grandfathers might have been Jews, but they're not Jews. Well, it's through patrilineal connection that they make the claim, well, so do Reform Jews. So in that context, it's only for the Black Jews that we're imposing the rule, and whereas we accept Reform Jews, or even Jews who are perceived to be biologically Jewish as real Jews. Right. And so what do I mean by that is I always used to find it quite comical as I was doing my research. I was up in New Haven at the time, and I'm starting my research and thinking about these things. And every time we go past the Chabad mobile, they had this big camper like thing, and it'd be outside, grabbing Jews off the street, and they never grabbed me. And I used to think to myself, oh, well, how do you know I'm not Jewish? And my wife, Sima, who looks, very, Jewish and Mediterranean, and has dark features, they grabbed her every time. There was like, oh, we're, lost flock, come back. And so it's in those kinds of judgments where race is kind of assumed to exist. So it may not be on the surface, but it might be behind, it might still be shaping people's judgments, just as it was shaping the judgment to, reach out to my wife or to reach out to me.
Right. It does seem to me that the law is invoked very specifically at those moments, and otherwise nobody's talking about the law pretty much at all.
But the thing is, it always is about who's talking about the law and who are they referring it to. And
Yes.
That kind of dynamic is the thing, that fluidity was what made Judaism seem very different from, say, the Christianity that I had been exposed to as a kid.
Okay.
And just to give you some background on that, because some people, my approach to religion is a bit eclectic. And so I had a Seventh-day Adventist nanny who raised me up until age 10. And so I did vacation Bible school with her. I knew all of the Old Testament stories, and I pretty much had a very strong indoctrination in the Seventh-day Adventist tradition. And then at age 9, my mom put me in an Episcopal church called the Little Church Around the Corner in Manhattan, which had a famous boys choir. And I sang there every Sunday for 5 years. So, I listened to the Episcopal stuff and, sang their hymns. And so, and then I went to a Jewish prep school. And so I was exposed to quite a bit of Christianity before I started delving into Judaism. And actually having that counterpoint was quite useful because it helped me see what was particularly unique about Judaism and Jewish practice in some ways. So I understood, for instance, there was a clear hierarchy in the church. That was clear. They were not independent, and unless you considered storefront churches the same, they didn't have that same kind of independence that Jewish synagogues seemed to possess. Right. And at the same time, there were these traditions of boundaries between the movements that were widely accepted across groups. And those became the kind of gatekeepers.
Yeah, I think that you have a fundamental, almost instinctual insight about the fluidity of different kinds of Jewish groups. And it comes across in your book. I mean, as I read your book about the 20th and 21st centuries and all of these different kinds of Jews from different, walks of life and some accepting halacha, some not, some, having different relationships to it, I kept on flashing back to the 1st century AD, the period at the destruction of the temple, in which we had, yes, there were rabbinic groups, but there was another group called the Therapeutai, and they were hanging out in Egypt. And there was another group called the Essenes, and they were shoving scrolls into the Dead Sea hills. And there were all kinds of different groups that were all, loosely attached, not all of them really following the same laws at all, but all of them really very much connected to the Exodus story, which is something that we need to talk about. So, but first, let's get to the racial project and questions about that. You started and continue to be a scholar of race. Your first book, Red Lines, Black Lives.
Black Spaces. Red
Black
Lines.
Spaces. Black Spaces. It's about a suburban Black community up in Yonkers, I think. Is that right?
It is.
Yeah. And so, you came fully engaged in racial questions of space, especially Blacks, African Americans. Then you switch over to a degree and start addressing Jews, and Jews have their own language of race surrounding them. So how did you, first of all, deal with those kinds of two discourses regarding race, one about Black people, another about Jewish people, and then how did you either tangle them or disentangle them in your discussions here in the book?
Wow. So much to think about in your question. Okay. I'm not sure how to answer that. Could you answer it in this different way?
Yeah, I'll try to rephrase it or reframe it. In the middle of the 20th century, it would have been almost inconceivable not to think about Jews without a racial context. In two decades into the 21st century, people seem to have forgotten it to a degree. So the language of referring to Jews racially is well established and has been for a long time, even if we have a contemporary amnesia regarding it. You certainly don't. You're also obviously, much of your scholarship is regarding the racial discourse regarding Black people. And so I just wondered whether or not there was confluence in these conversations.
Okay. No, this is great. This is a great question. Thank you.
Okay.
So I think the answer is that for my first project, looking at Runyon Heights, I started looking at segregation. And one of the things I wanted to do that was very different than most scholars in approaching segregation was that most people just assume, well, you have Black people and you have white people and you just study them. Well, I wanted to know, how did these people become Black and white? And so the question about why did they call themselves through a racial conception of themselves in the suburbs? Why? And so here I had a community that referred to itself as Black and middle class. And so my challenge was trying to understand, well, why? Because I don't just, how do I look at some person and decide, although I have a different Black identity than your Black identity, I know you're Black and you know I'm Black. Like, how do we come to this kind of collective conclusion? And it was that notion of the collectivity that I was really after, of trying to understand why those collectivities stay together. Because we assume that they're primordial, right? That, well, Black people look at other Black people when they say, oh, we're a group. But I thought to myself, well, when I'm in Africa, the Africans don't all look Black, but when the Africans come here, we're all Black. It doesn't matter where they come from. So it's those kinds of processes that I'm really trying to unravel. So when I turn to the question of Blacks and Jews, as I engaged in the encounter between Blacks and Jews in the New World, a few things started really becoming clear. One is that Jews were seen as an other within Europe, but at first that other was seen to be based in their religious practice. They were seen as Christ killers, and it was a religious-based anti-Semitism that existed. But when I started looking at Venice in the 13 and 1400s, I noticed that there was this shift to a preoccupation with the Jewish body itself, that it wasn't Jewish religion that seemed to be a threat, it was the body of Jews. And it was that threat of the Jewish body, as it was perceived as being over-sexualized, as Jewish women were seen to be wearing too much flaunty jewelry, as they established yellow garments for Jews to wear so that they could be identified in public, as they get locked behind closed gates at night in Jewish ghetto, which is the first place we have the word ghetto come from. It's that shift to the preoccupation with the Jewish body that coincides with a shift from anti-Jewishness that was symbolic to anti-Jewishness that was deeply violent. And so suddenly I see that here in the 1300s, starting with just one or two priests who decide that, these Jews, we need to really run them out of town with violence. It's not enough for the passion plays and the ritual that went on yearly where Jews sort of went and hid under the threat of violence. Now it became a full force riot, and the tradition of sort of the violent pogrom emerges. And it seems to coincide with this shift to a preoccupation with the Jewish body as the threat. And so it's here where I bring in the notion of Orientalism, as Orientalist ideas are clearly imposed on Jews. And I trace those Orientalist ideas and show how the notion that Jews are backwards and primitive and exotic and alluring and are part of this framework of Orientalism. And the idea of Orientalism is a concept that comes from Edward Said, who talked about how the West, the Occident, defined itself in opposition to the East or the Orient in ways that made the West masculine and the East feminine, in ways that that gave the legitimacy to manifest destiny and the orientation towards the racial others who are being discovered in the new lands. And Orientalism, which essentially says the West is modern and the East is primitive, provides a very strong basis for the logics that we find in the early race thinking of the 17th century as racial conceptions emerge. And so what I try to show in my book is that ideas about the body and race are beginning to emerge in Venice. But they're not quite full blown as race in the modern sense of the term, which really gets transformed in the 19th century into a biological term. But we're developing the idea that Jews are different, not because of their religious practice. And it's for this reason that we have, in fact, why the Inquisition seems to be so necessary. Because the idea is, at first, the belief that Jews could convert, once converted to Christianity, well, they're good now, they're safe. The belief was that no, they're still secret Jews. There's something deeper about Judaism. Although they say they converted, we know they're secret Jews. And I'm suggesting that this idea of this hidden Jewishness that emerges in this period of persecution in the 1400s is reflective of belief that the Jewish threat is not just the religion, it's in the Jewish body itself. Therefore, conversion is not enough to convince the Christians that Jews were safe. Thus, they had to be driven out.
Now,
thus the new Christians were then persecuted.
So if I hear you right, it really does boil down to the danger of Black bodies or the danger of Jewish bodies. And then by the 17 or 1800s, they have a more substantial biological language in order to describe that. But really, even earlier than on, it was just the existential existence of Jews being present physically that was kind of seen as dangerous.
Well, Tudor Parford has a new book. Do I have it? I used to have it right here. Oh,
Hybrid Hate.
Exactly, Hybrid Hate. And in that book, he does a very nice job of showing how the conceptions of Blackness and Jewishness have been conflated since the early modern era. Now, I picked up that conversation essentially in the 18th and 19th century, and I talked about, the Jewish body and the Jewish nose and how, Jewishness was being conceived in these biological terms. But I think Parford takes it to another level by showing how the very ideas of to make Jews Black and to make Blacks Jews has been a rhetorical strategy for 500 years.
Right. Okay.
And to me, that what he reveals in that is powerful, but it also, I think, supports the argument that I've been making that essentially a new way of thinking about difference in the body emerges with Jews in Venice and a preoccupation with the Jewish body that develops into racial thinking in the 17 and 1800s. And then, and so of course in the 1800s, the belief is that Jews are a race unto themselves. And by the 1900s, there is a shift in the conversation, and Jewish intellectuals like Horace Kalin and others argued for a sort of pluralistic conception of Jewish identity in America, i.e., hyphenated Jewish identity, and that allows a person to be both Jewish and American at the same time, as opposed to being seen as a racial other. And so I kind of argue that Jews have to negotiate that solidification of the color line precisely because in the 18th century, it was widely believed that Jews themselves were a race that may be non-white. And we see this conversation in the late 19th century amongst ethnologists about the exploring the sort of racial origins of Jews and asking the question, are Jews a race or not? And eventually concluding that Jews are part of the Semitic world, which in a sense used a linguistic term to help whiten them. Because Semites really is a linguistic conception, not a racial conception, but it became used as a racial conception.
It's so it and is a kind of myth. Let's I have this question for you because we've got about 10 minutes left here and about 2 hours worth of discussion to go forward. So let me ask you about this, trying to get at sort of let's cut out the external pressures for a minute and think about Jews, Black people, and Jewish Black people, and the stories that they sort of share. Basically trying to get to the Exodus story and what's appealing to it. It does seem to me that both Black Americans often and Jewish Americans share a myth, a story, the Exodus myth, and are both sort of competing to be the protagonist in that story, as it were.
Well, sort of. I would frame it like this. The religion of Afro-American slaves was very Old Testament based. And so it identified with Moses, it identified with the Exodus, it identified with a Messiah that would deliver people from oppression. And so it's very focused on the Israelites and has a strong identification with their journey to freedom. So you might say in the 19th century, Blacks who saw Jews, or should I say Christian Blacks who saw Jews as people of the book, which meant they were from the past, suddenly that past steps into the present as they meet real Jews. So this is, I think, somewhat of a shock to folks that, wow, they're because in their minds, Jews were part of this old narrative. Meanwhile, Jews who are persecuted with pogroms in Europe see themselves as the oppressed group and come to the United States and come to quickly realize that they can benefit by claims to whiteness and that the real oppressed group are Afro-Americans. That sets the two groups in an interesting dialogue. So not only do Afro-Americans identify with the Israelites, identify with Moses, some in the late 19th century identified so much that they began practicing what they saw as Judaism. And so this is where we can help understand some of the emergence of some of the early Black Hebrew Israelite groups, where the metaphorical identification that is so strong in sort of Old Testament Christianity becomes real, goes from metaphorical Israel to saying, hey, we're really Israel. And I think it's those kinds of dialogues that have, and the emphasis on the messianic deliverance of justice have placed the groups in very interesting dialogue about civil rights within the United States itself. And so I think that helps explain, well, why is it Jews and Blacks deciding that we're the ones that have to engage in civil rights? Well, Jews are very clear when the Springfield riots hit in 1908, that this is a threat to the Jewish community. As these violent racial riots spread, they're not quite sure, are they next? And so you might say that the lesson of the past 5 years under the previous president is a similar kind of process where the racial rhetoric, where we thought was just directed at those racial others, Latinos and Blacks and, you know, the shit countries. Well, we saw that violence spread out, and it went at Jews and other groups as well. And so for me, it's understanding that at the heart of all of this is a negotiation with whiteness and colonialism. And in fact, what I saw in the early Caribbean was Sephardic Jews, some of whom were slave traders themselves, but because they're establishing communities, these are mostly men, many of them convert many slaves, they intermarry. And in places like Suriname, you have large numbers of mixed race Jews who are practicing, part of this extended Jewish community. And so it's the, in the early 1700s, we see these communities split apart, and we also see the Surinamese community make rules against people of color within their own synagogue, which suggested to me, well, you don't need rules against people if people aren't there in the first place, do you? And so you can see that and of course, the early 1700s is precisely the time that in the colonial states, the solidification of the status of slave takes place. So between 1680 and the 1720s, we moved from white indentured servants and Black slaves being treated relatively the same way to perpetual bondage for African slaves and their children, whereas indentured servitude is temporary and is a contract. And so that distinction is not really solidified in colonial law until the 1720s. And so what I argue is that, well, this is exactly the racial piece that Jews start negotiating as early as the 1700s, where they recognize that this mixed race community that's a part of broader extension of them cannot exist in this colonial world. So in some ways, the break-off was necessary, right? The cleansing of the community from those African people of African ancestry was necessary in order for them to claim whiteness. And so you see some interesting, and then of course, those Jewish traders who became slave traders were themselves fleeing persecution in Europe. So the irony of one group fleeing persecution only to become the intermediaries for slave trading within the colonial states, this is what places Jews in this interesting dilemma in the colonial world.
Yeah, and continuing. I mean, that's in different forms, it's a continuing dilemma. Rachel's going to be on our case in just a minute here. So let me ask you, because we've hit 5 o'clock, we have a sort of a hard and fast ending time. Let me ask you, is there anything that I should have asked you and you'd like to sort of like to close with? What do you wish that,
well, yes, yes, I'll say this. I could not have done this research without the voices of the Black Jews who are in my book. The one thing that I wanted to do, because you mentioned this, most of the scholars that approached the Israelite community approached it with this question: are these people really Jews or not? And of course, they concluded, well, they're not really Jews. My challenge was to write a book where Hebrew Israelites would see themselves in the book and say, yes, that's a true representation of my life. And then Orthodox Jews or secular Jews would read my book, who were not Black, and say, yes, this makes sense. This is the Judaism I know. So I had these two goals in my, my ideal was sort of this group of Orthodox rabbis who said, yes, he got it right. And this group of Hebrew Israelites who said, yes, he still gave us respect and didn't treat us like a cult. Because what I started to understand is that all these religious groups are making up an awful lot. And so to certainly say that it's just the Hebrew Israelites who make up religion, I think maybe doesn't take the insights from Bill Maher about religion.
I think that that's an extraordinarily important a concept that your book relates clearly and brilliantly. I mean, if there's one thing that the book relates very clearly on that subject, is that there are certain Black people who are reverential of the Hebrew Bible and the Moses story, who believe that those stories are the property of Africa and Black people, and that other races should stay away. And so, yes, there's a certain group that's like that. Similarly, when one reads about that in your book, one has to remember what's not in your book, but it's a doppelganger, that there are certain white people who claim that they hold the ultimate authority over the Hebrew Bible and the Moses story, handed to them from Eastern Europe, right?
Nice.
And so both of those are racial projects. One is Black, one is white. They're structurally identical. They're even competitive. And
Here's
so
the key, though. The Black racial project is in opposition to white supremacy.
right.
That's the key. They're not equal projects coming at each other. One is an oppressive project and one is a reactive project to that oppression. And I think that is key in understanding what makes them a bit different.
That's a very fair adjustment of what I was saying. Rebecca's here, but I just want to just say one more thing for the rest of us who are not part of or don't imagine ourselves to be part of those racializing projects of Judaism. But for the rest of us who are in the middle, who are trying to learn from one another and see what different kinds of Jewish groups are doing nationally or internationally, your book gives us an entry into voices that have, that are percolating much more. But when you started this work, you've been part of this. You've been part of the harmony that we're now starting to hear much more strongly. So thank you so much for
Thank
your
you,
work.
Michael, for the invite and the great questions, and thank the AJHS for inviting me. And I just want to say one last thing that, when I was writing the book and was really feeling insecure about it, not knowing if Jews were going to like me or if the Israelites were going to attack me or if my own profession was going to attack me. And you said, no, this is good, keep going. And that gave me a lot of confidence. So I just want to say thank you for that confidence.
Yeah, I am proud to be associated with it in any way. So